Alright, this morning we're going to continue our series in NoSQL versus SQL and why this is not an intelligent debate. First thing to note, if you're a client or somebody who's looking for someone who knows things about NoSQL or SQL, whatever it is, and you want a good question to filter out those who know from those who don't know, the best question to ask is give a use case of a SQL database and a use case of a NoSQL database. Never hire someone who's like, well, there is no use case for a whatever it is, whether it's SQL or NoSQL. There is a use case, and so we're going to cover a brief example of those. Kind of the world of databases, the way I like to joke around is it kind of works like if you've seen the Underpants gnome, where it's collect underpants, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, profit. And I get a lot of people, I guess mainly because it's Austin and people want to start jobs or start businesses around here, I should say, and they don't know very much about databases. They don't know very much about business in general, and so they have an idea. They want to collect data. They have no idea here, and they want to profit, and so they think that what they're going to do in phase 2 is just hire every single person on the planet and spend as much money here. This, by the way, is where most businesses fail. But they're going to spend as much money as possible hiring database people, you name it. They don't have any idea how they're going to get from here to here. They're going to just try to do that, okay? Which is fine on one hand. On the other hand, it can be kind of problematic. So in phase 2, ask questions around, okay, so we have the option of using a NoSQL database, and we have the option of using a SQL database. Which one's better? What is an application of both? First, anyone who comes along and says, well, this one is useful and this one is not happening, okay? So a good example of where SQL is very useful, especially SQL Server, is a lot of my trading algorithms. I have a trading process mentally that is very consistent, very effective, and there's no reason to constantly change it up, right? It's very organized, and ultimately I make a decision, but the robots go out and they find the information. SQL Server especially is very quick, it's very effective. Probably in testing just sample sets of data, there's nothing out there that's faster, okay? That doesn't mean there won't be in the future, but for now it's pretty much the fastest thing. It's very useful. So trading is, and in fact if you look at some of the past videos on this channel, you'll see just some of the mental logic. I'm teaching logic that involves stocks and trading. So that's something that you're not going to get something better, or at least you're not going to find something faster or more effective than SQL Server, at least in my testing. Now, as far as NoSQL, a good example of an application of NoSQL, and it's funny because they may use it, they may not, is LinkedIn's Experience. They have, for a site that supposedly is built for anybody's job structure, they have the poorest quality structure I've ever seen. And what I mean by that is, if you look under Experience, and I'm a fan of LinkedIn, but I'm also not a fan of LinkedIn for this reason. They do not have any concept of how to build a database to reflect experience. Now, I don't know whether they're using SQL or not, but it almost seems like they are, because you have to put in the job title, you have to put in the company name. I mean, first of all, that doesn't reflect experience. That just reflects that you've worked for a company. I mean, what would you do if you're a freelancer? What would you do if you take projects on the side? Well, you put those under projects but okay, so suppose that you only take projects on the side. Suppose you don't work for a company, you just take, let's say, weekly projects. For instance, suppose you're a stay-at-home mom and you do 15 hours of, let's say, accounting work for a local church or a local nonprofit, and you're very good at your job. And so that 15 hours of work, because you're so good at what you do, is the equivalent of what most mid-level people would take them 40 hours of work to do, okay? So how do you put that? Well, you put the company name and you put the title. Okay, what if you work for multiple nonprofits? Well, then you need to come up with a company name. See how absurd that is? And then people go Google the company name and they can't find it. Well, because she's a stay-at-home mom. I mean, she's not following the same structure and rules that everybody follows, right? The point is it's not well designed, especially from the experience standpoint. Now, granted, I'm a big believer, and I say this to my clients, that if somebody comes along and they always put it up in front of time, they don't know what they're doing. It's all about results. It's not about time. Stock market, same thing. You can trade for 40 years and never make a dollar. Most people will make money if they trade for 40 years. Then there are people who've traded for less than a year, and I've seen them make 2,000% or more return, right? So it doesn't matter how long you've been trading. Time has nothing to do with being good at your job. It's a matter of, do you get the results? So as a case in point, I use this little simple MongoDB example. What we have here is a little job DB, and this would be like where we're putting experience. Of course, we notice the IDs exist and they're auto-populated by MongoDB to make sure that each document is unique, in the sense that even if it was repetitive data, the object ID would be different. You'll notice for this person, they're putting experience called weekly plumbing, right? And for their document here, they just have a name and description. I help friends and family members with plumbing issues. For this person here, they're saying, I work for company, non-existent company. My title is senior plumber, and my experience is 10 years. Notice they're not even doing a time frame. They may just say this many years of experience. In this document, we have a person who puts a title, and instead they list their clients. We see non-existent company, we see other non-existent company, and then other company not existing, and of course closing everything out. So these three documents are different. They're not the same documents at all, but they are stored in a collection, right? And if you think about it, if you've ever gone to those people who have their resume on their own website, not like a normal resume, but like, for instance, a person who's a writer may have a very different looking website resume than a person who, let's say, is a, what is the term, graphic designer, right? They have a very different looking resume web page. The reason why they have that is because they're acknowledging that, what I'm doing here is realistic. Right? In other words, this is what we all face. Like, we don't fall into this 40-hour work week that everybody does all the time. Like, that's not how experience is made. It may be project-based. It may be all this other stuff. And the way that LinkedIn does that, the way that they put their experience on there, what's actually building experience, by the way, for instance, maybe watching a YouTube video. It may be reading a book. That actually enhances your experience as well. It's not in touch with reality and how people are actually developing experience, and that varies. So all of these people out there with web pages, different web pages or different sites showing how they've gained experience, is in its own way a document structure. Imagine if you imported all of that into a collection in a database. You're right, each document would be very different than other documents. That's kind of an admission that SQL would be a mess. It just wouldn't work. You couldn't. It's too dynamic. It changes too much, and that's where you really see NoSQL as a very good solution, is in dynamic environments. If you have, like, say, a dynamic configuration table, configurations that are constantly changing, it's very useful. So when we look at the phase one and how we're going to collect data, what I like to tell clients is, okay, so are we looking at something that is changing, is relative to the client, like the person that you're going to be serving? Is like, what are we looking at here? What's our data structure going to look like? Is it always going to be the same thing? Like, for instance, in my trading algorithms, it's pretty much the same structure. Or how dynamic is it? Depending on how dynamic it is, in this phase two, we're going to turn to a solution like NoSQL. If it's pretty straightforward, we're going to keep a solution like SQL. And then, of course, finally, yes, we get to the phase, or some cases, sometimes not, which is profit. So always be asking that, like, what is an example of where NoSQL is a very useful solution, and what is an example of where SQL is a very good solution? And if you're a client and you're looking for good people, that's a good question to ask. Name an application where both solutions work, where SQL and NoSQL work. And if they can't come up with one for each, you don't want to hire them.